are the day-to-day practices that I've practiced, but I've actually gotten this a lot of it from other people who've been on a similar path, observing others who haven't been on this path and what the reaction is. Many of these things, you probably do them already. The first one is time alone. So time alone without distraction is probably one of the most important aspects of connecting with our core self. Why? Because our environment, especially the environments that we have around us, it's filled with distractions, filled with triggers that could trigger us emotionally and physically and so many other ways. And every time we feel triggered emotionally or physiologically, we're basically reliving a pattern that you were conditioned to be in a lot of ways. So what ends up happening, for example, you wake up, you turn on the news, they're talking about a lot of fearful things that are happening in the world. You have no idea how that triggers you internally. That might take you back to a moment when you were 3 years old and you watched a very traumatizing experience. And the rest of your day, you're dealing with that emotion instead of doing the things that matter to you. And you're not even aware of it because a lot of times you will feel drained or upset or stressed or you're reactionary. It just shows up in different ways. So not only that, everything else in our environment nowadays is designed to distract us, take our attention, from ads to news to other people, anything around you. So for us to even begin to go towards that, we need to spend time alone without any distraction, just sitting there, just with your thoughts, with your emotions, and with your body. Even if it's just for 10 minutes, 15 minutes a day, or 5 minutes a day, and not get distracted by your phone, by other people, by your environment, or not even listen to books in that moment, because that's a different area. Because a lot of times we think downloading information in our head is the best strategy, but a lot of times it's actually being with ourselves that help us connect with who we are. But when I say being alone with yourself, that means connecting with our emotions, connecting with our body, and observing our thoughts. Not being in our thoughts lost in our head, but actually feeling what's happening here. And maybe even connecting with a deeper aspect of, if you have a spiritual practice, that could be part of that too. Spending time alone and feeling your body and emotions. And the reason, and I'll give you a very simple technical reason. So most of the thoughts that are in our head and the conscious part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, they generally are a product of our environment, whatever conditioning we've had here. And they repeat as we learn new material, it gets downloaded into the subconscious part of our mind. But when are those moments where we react? So, for example, you are talking to somebody and they say something and it bothers you in a deep way. We think that in that moment we're responding to this situation, but well over 99% of the time, it's something to do with something that had happened that we hadn't resolved from the past. And what happens is in those moments, different parts of our brain gets engaged. If you were to divide it into a couple of regions, there's the reptilian part of our brain, and there's the limbic system, where one side deals with the emotions, the other one deals with sensations. And if you go far back to 3 years old, 2 years old, we don't have recall memory. We don't remember memories in the sense that we can't remember the event, but our body, our senses remember it. So if we've gone through a traumatic experience, we have a memory of it. We just can't recall it. We get affected by something and we don't even know why. All of a sudden, we're taken back there. Now, a lot of times when these things happen, we distract ourselves or we lash out on the other person or something like that, or we get involved in our phone and we don't even know what's happening. Our body is actually processing the same thing from the past again. It's trying to, but it doesn't know what to do because as a child, you didn't know how to assign a meaning to that. From a child's perspective, a traumatic experience like looking at the parents fighting looks like there's something off with the child, not the parents. Like, what did I do wrong in this environment? But it's not just traumatic experiences. It could be anything. It could be, are we aware of how we were impacted and are we dealing with it consciously or reactively based on our past? And this doesn't necessarily have to be a negative. We could be affected in that same way positively too. But then how do we make the choice? How do we consciously decide what we value now versus what we did in the past? So it could be even positive things that look like positive to you in the past, but it might not be positive now. But there has to be an awareness about it. So unless you're aware of how you feel in those moments and what's happening with your body, nothing changes. And there are two essential states that we're in, and they're on the extreme end, but they give you a good gauge. Or you feel fearful. These are usually, they go towards more the traumatic side. If you feel excited, connected, supported, loved, all that stuff, they go towards more the positive. Now, based on those two, you can gauge pretty well what are the experiences that actually bring you joy, what don't bring you joy. And the more aware you are of the negative ones, especially that are not related to the present, the easier you can interrupt them. Because a lot of times we want to think through our thoughts and fix things. While we can do that, unless you process those physiological changes, emotions or physiological changes, then they don't go anywhere. They just stay there. They need some kind of expression in your, as in they need your attention. So what that could look like is, let's say you were triggered by somebody. Let's say you talked to somebody and they said something that you did not like. Our normal mode of dealing with that is that you shouldn't say that to me. You're wrong about that. But you still didn't deal with it. What's happening here? What's going on in our system? All that could look like is just checking in, noticing the emotions, noticing the physiological changes, and start taking charge of your breathing. This is why breathing is such an important concept in meditation. Start taking conscious breaths to allow your body to process some of that stuff, not thinking through it. And after you stay with it for 2 to 5 minutes, you will notice that you will feel better naturally. Now you can go to the level of thought and say, okay, what kind of meaning do I want to assign to this? So that's another area. Now, this third area is expand perspective. I know you guys are already doing that just by being in a space like this, but from reading, being around people who know a little bit more or who can engage you with dialogues that are deeper, and specifically expanding your perspective in 3 areas. Understanding yourself a little bit more, whether that's your own psychology, understanding others a little bit more. Why do people behave a certain way? We have a lot of assumptions about why people behave a certain way. Oh, people are lazy. People are selfish. People are this, that, and the other. But no, we haven't actually looked into why do people behave like that. There are reasons behind them. And usually when we don't understand the reasons, we react to those behaviors. Now, none of that means people are justified. For example, if somebody hurts somebody physically, they're not justified to do that. But if we have an understanding or a curiosity to understand, we would actually try to study that so we don't repeat it in the future, or at least we can get an understanding so we can react to it in a much better way. And then the third one is understanding the world a little bit better. And this is where we open up a little bit to knowledge. Now, none of this means you need to become expert at psychology, expert at understanding others, or expert at understanding the world or any of that. But being open and curious about it can transform a lot of things. And I know you guys are being open to understanding the world better from different perspectives. Because sometimes we hold on to one way of viewing the world. And we're like, oh, this is how the world operates. But guess what? That's a very small puzzle. We need to look at the world from different ways, from a historical perspective, from a philosophical perspective, psychological perspective, scientific perspective, social perspective. So many perspectives come into it. And every time we assume that we know exactly what's happening in the world, it breaks down. And that's why a lot of the systems break down, because they're based on an assumption that's not tested, or it's tested in a very small area. That's why a lot of the systems in the West might not work in the East. And I'll give you a very good example of that. So when a lot of the humanitarian or people who want to kind of give back to the places in third world country, they will go there and build a well in a small village. And what they'll find out pretty soon is that people are very resistant to that. Or they'll build a bridge or build a school. And the problem is that they haven't actually understood how their life works. And they've assumed that if I put this there, it will improve their life. But a lot of times it doesn't. They haven't understood their worldview yet. They haven't understood what will actually give them a better quality of life. And then what makes it worse is when we force it onto others, such as let's force democracy. And one of my favorite quotes from Alan Watts when he talks about it is like, I mean, if you look at the history of the West, we want people to accept democracy, but we do it by pointing a gun at them. So it kind of beats the purpose of the whole thing. A lot of time we're forcing it towards the East. Now, I love democracy. I live in this system, but I also have come from a world where that might not work in a lot of parts. It might break down so fast because they have different systems, and we haven't actually tried to understand that. Fourth one is social support. This one is incredibly important. This is why you hear things like you're the average of 5 people around you. Without the right social support, you can do a lot of changes internally, but you're still influenced by the people around you with their thinking. Now, these people could be some of the closest people with you. Does that mean you completely cut them off? Well, if they're completely abusive, I would at least minimize my time around them, emotionally or physically, if not be around them at all. But more than likely, that's more complex than we think. So minimizing your exposure to the people that don't align with your values and your way of living, but maximizing, this is the part that's more important, maximizing your exposure to the people who align with your future values, your ideal self. That can completely transform things. This is why we're in these groups, because it helps us amplify those positive thoughts, positive and powerful perspectives. Last one, but not least, routines. So when I say routines, the reason why routines are important is because the way our mind works. Our conscious mind learns by experience. You're exposed to something and you look at it once, but you have to do it a couple other times, a few other times for you to for you to make it a permanent part of who you are. But if you're just exposed to something once, it might or might not affect your life. Bruce Lipton would say is a repetitive mind. There are two ways that we learn. We either learn in the first 7 years of our life by just mimicking our environment, by copying our parents, by just taking in information. And he even says that we are actually in a hypnotic state. Our brain waves are more theta aligned, which means that anything, and this is why if you want to know what the root of racism and all that stuff is and why people were racist in certain regions or why people were a certain way, because they were taught to be. Because the children looked up to their parents and they just followed along. They didn't have a way to decipher what's right or what was wrong in that. They just copied what their parents did, or their society did. And they did it over, and then up until 7, a lot of that programming was set up. Now, what happens after that is we need to actually do it quite a bit of time for us to get it into our subconscious. There's repetition, but with the repetition, there needs to be an emotional connection to it. There needs to be a deeper why connected to it too. And he or she never develops that interest. You will write it and learn a little bit, but then quit it pretty soon. But what if that child has a deep interest and so excited about riding a bike? They will fall a few times, but they will learn and will be sustained. And similar goes with a lot of other things. But aside from that, the things such as reading, it could be repetitive as well. Almost anything that we have, as much as sometimes we like spontaneous experiences, but the way for human beings it works is that repetition helps us grow faster. That doesn't mean we can't have spontaneity in our life, but we can have it at certain times or certain parts. We already do. For example, weekends for a lot of people are family time or certain parts of weekdays. That helps us connect with that side in those moments. And when we repeat being at a work time or exercise time, our system easily adapts to that. But those are some tips, and it starts with time alone with yourself without distractions, feeling your body and emotions more within that time or any time actually outside of that, expanding your perspective about yourself, others, and the world at large, getting that social support that will help move you forward, and developing routines, whether those are spiritually aligned, socially aligned, personally aligned, developing routines to help you grow.